They say when you've lost everything, you stop being afraid of anything. That's a lie. After the accident, I thought I'd reached the bottom. Turns out, there's a place below rock bottom, where silence doesn't soothe, it stalks. That's where I found myself when I moved into apartment 3B of the Maraway building. It was cheap, clean, and had this vintage charm. The kind that made you feel like you were stepping into someone else's memory. The kind of place that shouldn't be affordable. But I wasn't asking questions. I just needed walls around me, a roof, a place where his voice wouldn't echo in my head every time I closed my eyes. The building had a smell. Not bad, just old. Like paper and rust. The elevator groaned like it remembered every soul that had ridden it since 1928. And the hallways. Long, dim, the kind that tricks you into walking faster because you feel like you're being watched. But the apartment? It was almost perfect. Tall windows, wooden floors that creaked just enough to feel alive, and quiet. So damn quiet. The first night, I barely slept. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had become a stranger since the crash. I lay there in the dark, listening. At first I thought it was the plumbing, then maybe the neighbors. But it didn't take long to realize it wasn't coming from above or below. It was the walls. The sound was faint, like a breath drawn between words. Whispers, but not clear. More like a murmur too shy to finish a sentence. I told myself it was nothing. I had to tell myself that. Because if I didn't, well, the alternative was that something was whispering to me through the goddamn walls. I tried to shake it off the next morning. Coffee helped, so did unpacking. The apartment looked better with life in it. I found an old radio someone had left in the kitchen cabinet. It didn't work, but I kept it on the counter anyway, like it belonged there. That afternoon, I met Mrs. Lenore, the landlady. White hair, soft voice, but sharp eyes. She asked if everything was all right in the apartment, and I almost told her about the whispering, but her look stopped me. It was the kind of look that said she already knew. She smiled and handed me a lemon cake, then walked away with a limp. I told Dr. Marcus about the noise during my therapy session over the phone. He said it might be auditory hallucinations from sleep deprivation, or maybe the start of something deeper. I didn't care what he called it, as long as it stopped. But that night, it didn't. It got louder. That's when I noticed the temperature shift. One moment, I'd be wrapped in my blanket, shivering. The next, the room would feel like summer. And then there were the objects. My keys. My notebook. A glass I left on the windowsill. They'd move. Not far. Just enough to make me question myself. I started taking photos of where I left things. Comparing. Documenting. I needed proof that I wasn't going insane. And then, 3 days after moving in, I found the journal. It was tucked behind a loose board in the closet. Leather-bound, brittle pages. The name inside, Sarah J. No last name. Just a first initial. Her entries started normal. Descriptions of the apartment, complaints about the elevator, notes about the noise in the walls. But then the entries turned frantic. Sentences half-finished. Words scratched out violently. The last page just said, "It's watching through the mirror." That night, I covered every mirror in the apartment. But the whispers didn't stop. They got louder. And they started saying my name. I don't remember falling asleep that night, only waking up with the closet door wide open. I know I shut it before bed. I'm certain of it. I had this growing ritual. Check the locks, turn off the lights, make sure the closet door was shut tight. But that morning, it stood ajar, like it had something to show me. Something I was supposed to find, and I did. Behind a warped wooden panel in the back of the closet, my fingers grazed a crack, just wide enough to pry loose. I pulled it open and found a small hollow space, and inside, a journal. Its leather was worn soft, like it had been touched 100 times by nervous hands. No dust, no mold, too clean for something forgotten. Almost like it had been waiting. The name inside the cover was simple. Sarah J. No last name, no date. The first few entries read like a diary. Mundane thoughts about the building, how the pipes groaned at night, how the windows always fogged from the inside. But a few pages in, the tone changed. She mentioned the whispers. At first, she thought they were neighbors talking late at night, maybe thin walls. Then she realized the voices came when the building was silent. Midnight murmurs through plaster and brick, never loud, never clear, until they started saying her name. That hit me, because I hadn't told anyone yet, but I'd heard it too. Emma. Soft and stretched out, like someone unfamiliar with the word was trying it out for the first time. It always came from behind the walls or under the floor. Sarah wrote that it followed her into the bathroom, echoed faintly behind the mirror, and sometimes she'd see movement behind her in the glass. I closed the journal then, heart racing. I wanted to believe I was just reading someone else's madness, not my own. But when I went to the mirror that night, I stood frozen. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I almost saw. Movement. Just at the edge of my vision. A flicker. Gone before I could blink. I left the light on and slept with the journal under my pillow. Dr. Marcus told me during our next session that I was projecting. That survivor's guilt can manifest through projection and disassociation. That Sarah's story could be seeding my imagination. But I didn't tell him the newest entry hadn't been there the night before. I would have sworn the journal ended with a sentence that trailed off. But this morning, there was another line written in shaky ink. You're not alone in there. I don't know how it got there. I don't want to think about that. I tried to ask Mrs. Lenore about Sarah. I figured she had to know something. She smiled too quickly, her eyes darting toward my apartment door before she said, "Some tenants leave. Some forget to leave." Then she changed the subject. Offered me more lemon cake, like that could sweeten away the truth. That night, I covered the mirrors again. Sheets, towels, anything. I didn't want to catch that flicker again, but it didn't help. The whispers got bolder. They repeated phrases from my therapy call. Whole phrases, word for word. You're not responsible for his death. That was something Dr. Marcus had said to me. I heard it again, in the wall, whispered in my voice. I threw the journal across the room. It hit the wall and thudded to the floor. A second later, I heard the thud again. Not from the floor, from inside the wall, like something was mimicking me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, lights on, eyes on the closet. I think I saw something move inside, a shape, dark, crouched low. But when I blinked, it was gone. In the morning, I picked up the journal, and there it was, another new entry. Same shaky handwriting. Don't look in the mirror. Too late. It's hard to explain how a place can feel smaller and larger at the same time, but that's what started happening. The layout of the apartment would subtly shift. Corners seemed to stretch farther away. Doorways appeared where they hadn't before, and sometimes the bedroom felt like it was pressing in on me, the walls leaning closer. At first, I blamed my lack of sleep. Hallucinations. That's what Dr. Marcus would say. I even repeated it to myself out loud. You're just tired, Emma. Just tired. But the walls didn't stop closing in. I started marking the floor with chalk lines, measuring spaces between furniture every night. And every morning the measurements were different. Not by much, just enough to make me feel like I was slipping. The kind of shifting that makes you question not just your mind, but reality itself. I began waking up in strange places. Once, curled up on the floor of the kitchen, cold tile pressed to my cheek. Another time, I came to standing in the hallway outside the apartment, door open behind me, bare feet on freezing linoleum. I had no memory of how I got there. My phone was in my hand with the camera app open. I checked the gallery and found a new picture of my bedroom wall, dimly lit, something shadowy in the corner. The timestamp was 3:33 a.m. I showed it to Dr. Marcus during our video session. He tilted his head and asked if I remembered taking it. I told him no, and he frowned the way people do when they're trying to be polite, but they think you're slipping. He told me trauma can splinter the mind, that sleepwalking and memory blackouts are signs of dissociation. I nodded and pretended that helped. But what I didn't tell him was that in the background of the photo, just barely visible in the mirror, was a figure behind me. not mine. The whispers had become something more than whispers now. They knew things. They'd repeat lines from my conversations, words I hadn't said aloud. One night, I was brushing my teeth and the voice behind the wall whispered, "You don't deserve to be alive." It was my voice. It mimicked me perfectly, and I dropped the toothbrush and stared into the mirror, waiting for that flicker of movement in the corner. It came. This time, it didn't vanish when I looked directly. It lingered. My shape, but not my reflection. Slightly off, watching me. That was the night I started researching the building. I spent hours online, pulling up old property records, newspaper clippings, and forums filled with rumors. A pattern began to form. Missing tenants, all from Unit 3B, one in 1962, another in 1981, one as recent as 2007. All young, all lived alone. Each had been reported missing after months of strange behavior. Withdrawal, erratic statements, claims of voices in the walls. I confronted Mrs. Lenore about it the next day. I didn't even knock. I just walked into her apartment and asked, "What happened to the girl before me?" She smiled like I was a child talking nonsense. "There's been many girls before you, dear," she said, pouring tea with a trembling hand. "The building has its moods. It chooses who it wants." I asked her what that meant, but she just sipped her tea and looked toward the hallway with tired eyes. "They all think they can leave," she whispered. That word, leave, stuck with me. I decided then that I needed out. Just a break. A night somewhere else. A hotel. Anywhere. I packed a bag and stepped into the hallway. But when I reached the elevator, it didn't open. The button didn't light up. I took the stairs instead. Down one flight, then two, then three. But I never reached the ground floor. The staircase kept twisting, doubling back, leading to doors marked with numbers that didn't exist. 5A, 6D, 7Z. When I opened one, I found myself back on my floor. I stood in front of my apartment door, the number 3B staring at me like a taunt. I hadn't gone in a circle. I had gone somewhere else. And now, it seemed, there was no way out. I sat in the hallway and cried. I cried not because I was scared, but because for the first time, I realized I might not have come here by chance. Something brought me to this place. Something chose me, and I was starting to believe that maybe it had been waiting for me all along. I stopped trusting the mirrors completely, covered everyone with towels, newspaper, tape, anything to keep from seeing what didn't belong. But even without them, I still caught glimpses. In the glass of the oven, in the dark TV screen, once in the reflection of my own eyes. Always there, always just a fraction off, like watching myself from the wrong angle. I started walking past anything reflective with my head turned, heartbeat thumping against my ribs like it wanted out. And I couldn't sleep anymore. Not just because of the noise, but because I was afraid of what I'd do in my sleep. Or worse, what someone else would do while using my body. The phone was the worst. I'd delete photos, only to find them back the next morning. Photos of me asleep, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. Sometimes I looked vacant. Sometimes I was smiling. Not a real smile, not mine. It made me sick. The timestamps always marked between 2 and 4 a.m. And always there was something blurry in the background. A shape. Still. Watching. I began to feel like the apartment was responding to me. Like it was aware. I'd think about fire, and the stove would click on. I'd wish for silence, and the pipes would shriek. The whispers weren't random anymore. They knew me. They anticipated me. They'd say, "She's looking now," or "Not yet," or "Almost time." I couldn't tell if they were talking to each other or to me. The worst was the bedroom wall, the one behind the bed. The whispering was loudest there, too loud to ignore now. At night, I'd put my ear against it, hoping to make sense of the sounds. And one night, I heard something different. A rhythm. A pattern. It was faint, but unmistakable. breathing. Long, slow inhales and exhales, as if the wall itself had lungs. That's when I snapped. I pushed the bed across the room and just stared at that wall for hours, waiting, listening. I didn't know what for, but I knew it was something. I started scratching at the wallpaper. The surface was soft in places, like the drywall had rotted from the inside. It peeled easily, revealing strange symbols carved faintly into the wood beneath. Circles, spirals, interlocking lines that made my head throb if I looked too long. Sarah's journal had mentioned these. I flipped through its crumbling pages again and found a sketch. Rough, frantic lines that matched what I saw. She'd written, "It's not the pipes. The building is alive, and it's hungry." I wanted to run. I really did. But something stopped me. Not fear. Not confusion. It was that same pull I felt the day I signed the lease. An invisible thread, tugging at the center of my chest. Drawing me closer to the center of something I didn't understand. So I started researching again. The building's original blueprints were hard to find, but not impossible. It was designed in 1927 by an obscure architect named Halverson Carr. His notes were filled with strange references to dimensional tuning and resonant hollows. He believed architecture could channel other planes. Thin spots, he called them. Places where the veil between the living and the dead was weakest. And he built this place to find them. The geometry of the Marrowway wasn't accidental. Its corners weren't true 90 degrees. The walls curved ever so slightly inward. The materials used, limestone, hematite, wood treated with ash, each had some kind of folklore link to the spirit world. Carr had engineered this place to listen, and it had been listening for a long, long time. I realized then that I hadn't found the apartment. It had found me. It had called to me, like it had called to Sarah, like it had called to everyone before me. I sat in the center of my room that night, surrounded by candlelight, Sarah's journal open beside me, the floor trembling under my skin like a heartbeat. And I whispered back, "Okay, I'm listening now." And the wall whispered back, "Good." I stopped trusting time. I don't mean in the poetic sense. I mean literally. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into seconds, and I'd lose entire chunks of the day without knowing where I'd been. I kept trying to write things down, timestamp my own reality. Sticky notes, journals, phone voice memos, but they'd go missing, or worse, I'd find them in my own handwriting saying things I didn't remember writing. Phrases like, "Don't trust the morning light," and "He's closer now," and always scribbled in shaky, frantic loops, like whoever wrote it was afraid of their own hand. Sometimes I'd find them already aged, yellowed, smudged, like they'd been there for years. I woke up one afternoon on the floor of the hallway, my bedroom door ajar behind me. My hands were covered in dust and splinters. When I looked down, I saw a crowbar on the ground, and the closet door cracked wider than it had ever been. I didn't remember prying anything open. But there, behind the back wall of the closet, was a gap in the wooden paneling. A crawl space. I should have turned away. I should have called someone. But curiosity doesn't always feel like a choice. It felt like compulsion. I crawled inside. It was cramped and choking with dust. The walls were covered in symbols, etched, scratched, drawn in what I prayed was charcoal. And at the end of the crawl space was a room. Not a full room, just a space large enough for someone to crouch. And someone had, recently. Blankets, candle stubs, a small mirror propped against the wall with smudged fingerprints. There were notes, pages torn from a notebook. One said, "There are no reflections here, only watchers." Another said, "It lets you out when it wants you back in." I backed out quickly, heart hammering, and sealed the space behind me. But the sound started immediately afterward, a steady knocking from behind the wall. Rhythmic, deliberate. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks, like something trying to communicate. Or warn. Dr. Marcus called. He said he was concerned, that I hadn't returned any messages. I told him about the room, about the time slips, about the notes that weren't mine but were. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that chilled me deeper than anything I'd heard through the walls. "Emma, are you sure you're still alive?" I laughed. Awkward. Joked about bad sleep and stress. But after the call ended, I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying his words. And then I checked my phone's voice recordings. One file stood out. I hadn't named it. I didn't remember recording it. But it was timestamped the same time as the call. I hit play. And it wasn't my voice. It was mine, but wrong. Hollow. Slower. Like a mimic speaking underwater. It repeated only one sentence, over and over again. "You're not supposed to be here." I dropped the phone. I ran to the front door, threw it open. The hallway outside was pitch black. Not dim. Black. Like a void. No lights. No distant sounds. I stepped back in and slammed the door. The moment I did, the whispers returned, all around me now, like 1,000 voices humming in my ears, too many to separate. I ran to the windows, but when I pulled the curtains, there was nothing outside. Not the city, not the street, not even the sky. Just gray. Like fog had swallowed the world and I was floating somewhere in between. I thought I had been slipping away slowly, but now I realized I was already gone. The world I remembered had moved on. The whispers were getting louder because I was finally listening, finally near enough to hear them clearly. And one voice, soft and aching, whispered something new. "You were never meant to stay." The wall behind my bed had always whispered the loudest. It had become my compass in the madness, the source I feared and followed. The voice that called my name from within had grown clearer, more confident, like it had been waiting for me to understand it all along. I knew what I had to do. I had known for days, maybe weeks. I just didn't want to admit it. But when time had stopped obeying and the world beyond my windows dissolved into static gray, there was no point pretending anymore. I was no longer part of that world. I wasn't even sure I ever had been. So I broke the wall. Not angrily, not in panic, just deliberately, like uncovering a memory buried in the drywall. I used the crowbar again. The plaster cracked open easily this time, almost welcoming. Behind it, I found another space, a room that didn't appear on any blueprint. It wasn't just empty, it felt wrong. The air was thick and cold and somehow vibrating. Every breath I took in that hidden place tasted of something old, metallic, and burned. Candles, dried herbs, carvings in the floor, circles inside circles, names etched in Latin, bones, small, bird-like, some human-sized, old photos pinned to the wall, their faces burned out, eyes missing, mouths scratched into crooked smiles. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal with papers scattered around it, handwritten notes, blueprints, and diagrams from the building's original architect, Halverson Carr. It wasn't just a building. It was a structure of invitation, a designed ritual. Carr believed sound could open doors, that certain frequencies, patterns, and architecture could align to form a passage. He called it acoustic convergence, a way to thin the veil between the living and the dead. And apartment 3B? It wasn't randomly chosen. It was the key. Emma, Sarah, the others. We weren't just residents. We were conduits, mediums selected by something that listened, something that watched. And now, I understood. I hadn't survived the crash. I had died that day with him. The pain, the grief, the survivor's guilt. It was all a tether. A weight that had kept me here, walking through a world I didn't belong to anymore. And the Marrowway? It wasn't haunted. It was a threshold. As I stood in that room, the whispers turned to words. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Echoes of lives, regrets, final thoughts, unfinished sentences, all pouring through me. I dropped to my knees, unable to hold them in. They surged like a wave, a flood of sorrow and confusion, and at the center of them, I heard his voice. Ethan, my fiancé. Soft, steady, calling my name the way he always did. He said he had waited, that he tried to reach me, that he had been whispering all along. Every reflection I'd glimpsed, every word I heard twisted in static. It had been him, distorted by the veil. and I had been fighting it. Fighting him. I wept until I couldn't move, until I couldn't breathe. And then I did the only thing that made sense. I walked into the circle on the floor, placed my hands on the stone, and whispered back, "I'm ready." The light in the room shifted. The walls sighed, the air grew still, and then, nothing. No pain, no fear, just silence. The first true silence since I arrived. I don't remember falling asleep in that room. Only waking up to silence. Not the uneasy quiet I'd grown used to. This was absolute, clean, as if the building had exhaled and gone still for the first time in decades. The walls no longer pulsed. The whispers had stopped. Time had stopped. I stood up slowly, expecting the room to shift again, to spit me out into some twisted version of reality like it always did. But it didn't. It just waited. The light was different now. Soft, golden, and warm in a way that didn't belong in the Maraway. I walked back through the apartment, expecting the familiar decay, the shadows, the hallways that led nowhere. But the place felt less like a trap now, and more like a memory. Mine, maybe. Or someone else's. The photos on the wall were no longer burned. The faces were visible, laughing, familiar. And in the mirror across the room, uncovered now, I didn't see the distorted version of myself I'd come to fear. I saw me. Just me. And beside me, in the reflection, Ethan. He didn't speak, but I felt him. Not just in the room, but in my chest, like my heart had been carrying the weight of him this whole time. I reached for him, and this time, he didn't vanish. This time, he took my hand. I understood everything in that moment. The whispers, the madness, the bending of time and space. It had all been the building's way of guiding me to the truth. Not to torment, but to awaken. I hadn't survived the crash. That world I clung to had already let go of me. But I hadn't let go of it. The Maraway had waited. It had held me in its strange living silence until I was ready to understand that I didn't belong there anymore. I turned the doorknob of my apartment one final time. The hallway was still there, but not dark now. The elevator doors were open, the interior softly lit. I stepped in with Ethan beside me. No floor buttons, no numbers. Just the hum of motion. As the doors closed, I looked back one last time at 3B. It wasn't a haunted room. It was a passage, a chrysalis. And I had finally emerged. The elevator rose, or maybe it didn't move at all. I can't say. But when the doors opened again, I stepped into light. Full, clear, blindingly peaceful. And the whispers? They weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, clear, beautiful, calling out to welcome me home.